welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in. We're studying the history of the Jesuit order in the United States. In this book that we're reading, Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. And the purpose of our studying the history of the Jesuits since their founding is to discover what their means, motives, and modes of operation might be today. And reminding my listeners that the Jesuits, out of all the nations of the world, have found a refuge, a base of operations in the United States. And we need to understand what this bodes for the future of this country, and how the Jesuit occupation of Washington, D.C., and other powers and other centers of power in the United States of America has affected our history so far. And this author, R.W. Thompson, is one of the most astute writers, one of the most prophetic writers that I've ever read here on Inquisition Update. And I hope my listeners appreciate what R.W. Thompson is bringing to the table here. So far, we've covered the Jesuits' influence in Spain and Portugal. Now we're going to talk about their influence in France to better understand what drives the Jesuit order. What are their goals and purposes? In a nutshell, that is, to bring the whole world to their knees in subjection to a global dictator. Now, beginning the first full paragraph on page 92, backing up just a few sentences for continuity this morning, it says, in addition to what the Protestant Reformation had accomplished in Germany, where its defenders had been inspirited by the presence, intrepidity, and eloquence of Martin Luther, its influences had become so extended in France as to alarm all who saw it the probable loss of power. It drew the alarm of all who saw in Protestantism the probable loss of power. In other words, we're talking about the monarchs of France. Remember, Protestantism liberated the people of Europe. Governments were overthrown because of the Protestant Reformation. The papal monarchs were overthrown, and the people elected their own kings and wrote their own constitutions and laws. This was unheard of in the world prior to the Protestant Reformation. And the nations fell one by one, leaving the papacy literally without hope of survival unless the Protestant Reformation could be turned around and destroyed. 1 second, please. All right, so in addition to what the Protestant Reformation had accomplished in Germany, where its defenders had been inspirited by the presence, intrepidity, and eloquence of Martin Luther, its influences had become so extended in France as to alarm all who saw in it the probable loss of power and the end of those oppressions by which they had so long and successfully maintained their authority. Protestant churches were erected not only in Paris, but in all the principal cities in every province of France. King Henry II saw all this with intense dissatisfaction and was therefore in a condition to look favorably upon suggestions from any quarter that would give promise of forcing back and advancing the tide of popular enlightenment and Protestant progress. He inherited from his father the most intense malignity toward what he called the quote-unquote new religion, speaking of Protestantism as a new religion, mainly on account, unquestioningly, of its tendency to endanger the absolutism of monarchy. So here we have the monarchs of France fully aware of what result will come about by Protestant influence in France. That is the toppling of the papal monarchy. These people want to remain on their thrones in France. They're going to have to deal with the Protestants. They're going to have to give them Protestant liberties. They're going to have to give up on tyranny. They're going to have to give up on imposing Roman Catholic canon law on those who protest the Roman Catholic Church. So this is a dangerous situation in France. Protestantism was becoming popular in Roman Catholic France. This unnerved the monarchy. And it says, and he also inherited a persecuting spirit, which by indulgence had outgrown even that of his father. All students of French history are familiar with the chief events of his reign, which caused Henry of Navarre, afterwards Henry IV, Anthony de Bourbon, Louis de Conde, Admiral de Coligny, Francis d'Andelot, and other lords to unite with the reformers and place themselves at the head of the Huguenots. Now, for those who don't know, the Huguenots are a religious sect, a Protestant sect in France, and they are opposed to papal tyranny. And they are Calvinistic in belief, Protestants, and they were called Huguenots after one of their leaders. Now, with such accessions as these, the persecuted Protestants of France became formidable in all parts of the country. And Henry II found employment for all his royal resources in contriving methods for their suppression, an object of which he seldom lost sight. So here in Henry II, we have a papist who sees a threat in Protestantism and engages in persecution from the throne of France against the Protestant Huguenots. And it says, wherever Protestantism appeared, the spirit of persecution rose up to extinguish it. An eminent French historian says, quote, during the reign of Francis I, within the space of 23 years, there had been 81 executions for heresy. During that of Henry II, 12 years, there were 97 of the same cause. And at one of these executions, Henry II was present in person on the space in front of Notre Dame, a spectacle which Francis I had always refused to see. Okay, King Francis I of France, was a persecutor of Protestants, and he was outdone by Henry II, who even attended the public burnings at the stake of French Huguenots, French Protestants. And notice also that this took place in front of Notre Dame. Isn't it amazing that the American people will tolerate a Roman Catholic university in this country named after that college in France where Protestants were burned? Yes, Notre Dame in France is where Protestants were burned. And it says, he states also that during the reign of Henry II and the year before his death, quote, 15 capital sentences, 15 death sentences had been executed in Dauphiny, in Normandy, in Poitou, and at Paris, unquote, and that within that period, the penal legislation against quote-unquote heretics had been greatly increased in severity. So we see escalating persecution of non-Roman Catholics in France. Death sentences issued against those who defied the authority of the papacy. Now, Francis II was distinguished for nothing so much as for his uncompromising animosity to the Protestant Reformation, to all its legitimate fruits, and to those who professed Protestantism. He was entirely under the dominion of the Guises. The Guises, okay? This is a sect of the Roman Catholic Church that were rabidly anti-Protestant. Okay? He was entirely under the dominion, the control of the Guises, who were the bloodiest and most unrelenting persecutors in France. To signalize his submission to them, he issued a royal proclamation, which they dictated. In other words, the Guises wrote this proclamation, and the king issued it. This proclamation for razing to the ground and demolishing the houses in which the Protestants met for religious worship. So now we have government-sponsored religious persecution and burning of Protestant churches. They're not just burning bodies, they're burning churches too. This is an all-out war against Protestantism. And it says Protestant assemblages were declared unlawful. Do you understand why we have freedom of assembly in this country? We have the right to peacefully assemble. We got it because of the horrors of history. The horrors of France against Protestants. Their assemblages were known as unlawful. Okay? And if you were meeting together to profess the Protestant religion or practice the Protestant faith, you placed yourself under a death sentence in France. It says Protestant assemblages were declared unlawful, and those who attended them were punishable with death, as were also those who sheltered and protected them. Okay? So if you were a Protestant, you were sentenced to death. And so were those who may have sympathy and try to protect you. I'm sure it's difficult for many of my listeners to even wrap their brains around such types of persecution, especially in this day and age. But it goes on today. Nothing has changed. Same stuff, different century. All right? In about 5 months of this merciless reign, quote, 18 persons were burned alive for heresy, unquote. That is, for having professed the Protestant religion. What is the Protestant religion? It's the Oriental faith of Jesus Christ and the apostles. Okay? The monarchism of the papacy arose long after. This is the papal system is the apostasy that the Bible speaks of. Paul warned of this apostasy, this falling away that would take place. And the papal system is that falling away. The Protestant Reformation was merely a return away from the errors of Rome and back into the liberties of Christ. All right? Now, it says, in this condition, France opened a broad and attractive field of operations for the Jesuits. All right? You know what the Jesuits are all about. Their purpose, number one, is to destroy Protestantism and all forms of government that rose out of the Protestant Reformation. We refer to them as popular forms of government, and to restore the world to a papal dictatorship. Okay? Now, France is already aligned against Protestants because of the influence of the Guises and other influences in France. And this is just prime territory for the Jesuits. You must understand that the door of France has swung wide open. The door of opportunity for the Jesuits has swung wide open in France. It says, in this condition, France opened a broad and attractive field of operation for the Jesuits. Keeping steadily in view the principal and primary purpose of their organization, the suppression of the Protestant Reformation, they must have thirsted for an opportunity to bring their peculiar tactics into practice, not only for the accomplishment of this cherished object, but to reduce the Gallican Christians into such obedience to the papacy as would subject the temporal affairs of France to the dominion of Rome, when they expected to become, through the influences of Loyola over the Pope, the chief agents in executing the papal mandates. So one of the other purposes, the secondary possibly purpose of the Jesuits in entering France, was not only to destroy the Protestants and the Protestant Reformation, but to force the Gallicans back under the temporal rulership of the Pope. Remember, they didn't want any mixture of church and state. The Pope could be the Pope if he wanted to be and rule over the church. That was fine with the Gallicans. But they wanted the papacy to have no part in the civil affairs of France. So they were a consistent opposition to the temporal power of the Pope. And the Jesuits, while they were destroying and extirpating and annihilating the Protestants, their principal job, their secondary purpose was to subject the Gallicans to the temporal sword of the Pope. Now, the Cardinal of Lorraine, one of the Guises, he's anti-Protestant. The Cardinal of Lorraine, one of the Guises, was in full sympathy with them, that is, the Jesuits. And as he had been instrumental in dictating the persecuting policy of Henry II and Francis I, he must have rejoiced at the opportunity of obtaining Jesuit assistance in a work so congenial to himself and them. He was, quote, inordinately vain, intensely selfish, an adept in the art of dissimulation, which he used without scruple, unquote. And these qualities must have commended him to the Jesuits, as they, on account of possessing the very same attributes, were doubtless commended to him. That he was ambitious and a special favorite of the Pope is indicated by the multiplicity of the offices he filled at the same time. Besides being a cardinal, he held 2 archbishoprics, 6 bishoprics, and was abbot for each of 4 monasteries. All right, this is the Pope's man in France, right? Now, it says such a man as the Cardinal of Lorraine could, of course, render most essential aid to the Jesuits, as the Jesuits could to him. He and Ignatius Loyola were par nobile fratem, each possessing such qualities as fitted him to become a proficient auxiliary of the other in the pursuit of a common object. After he had succeeded in combining against the French Protestants all who were under royal influence, he hastened to Rome, where under the immediate auspices of the Pope, he desired to arrange with Ignatius Loyola personally for the introduction of the Jesuits into France. To facilitate the measure, he proposed the establishment of the Inquisition in France, with the purpose of disposing of heretics according to the method employed against the Albigensians by Pope Innocent III. Remember, Innocent III completely annihilated the Albigenses and destroyed their history. For all practical purposes, as evidence in the world is concerned, there's no evidence that the Albigensians even existed. That's how thoroughly that Pope Innocent III annihilated the Albigenses, simply because they demanded religious liberty. Now, to facilitate the measure, he proposed the establishment of the Inquisition in France, the legalized union of church and state, so that the church could condemn the heretics and then compel the state to burn them at the stake. That's the Inquisition, with the purpose of disposing of heretics according to the method employed against the Albigenses by Pope Innocent III, and which had been, after many years of disuse, successfully revived in Italy, Spain, and Portugal under papal patronage and protection. So we're seeing a revival of the Inquisition. It had been reinstituted in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and now France wants the Inquisition to come to France. And it says he was received with marked distinction at Rome by both the Pope and Ignatius Loyola, and having experienced no difficulty in obtaining their approval of his proposed plan of operations, he returned to France to carry it into execution by exterminating Protestantism, destroying the liberties of the Gallican Christians, and reestablishing the unity of religious faith by inquisitorial compulsion. So the iron rod of Rome is going to descend on France through this archbishop with the help of Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuits, and the papacy. Protestantism is in dire straits in France at this particular time in history. Now, he found the king still in full sympathy with him, and consequently had no difficulty in procuring from him royal letters patent by which he gave his consent to the Jesuits to enter France as an organized religious society, to build a house, that is, a novitiate, and a college in Paris, and to, quote, live therein according to their rules and statutes, unquote. So this is an assertion that the Jesuits are not going to be bound, at least not by the King of France, to any civil law. They're going to be able to occupy their own house and run their own college according to their own rules and statutes, okay? According to the tenets of the Constitution of the Jesuits. The equivocal Constitution of the Jesuits. Now, these facts, narrated with all possible brevity, says R.W. Thompson, show the extraordinary means of which Loyola availed himself in his lifetime to force his society into France in opposition to the Gallican Church, the almost entire body of the Gallican Christians, and the people. Relying upon the aid of the Pope, the King, the Cardinal of Lorraine, and such courtiers as crowded about the royal palace and echoed the royal will, he expected to overcome all opposition, and by employing the terrible machinery of the Inquisition, to make himself, the Jesuit general, to make himself the master of France, or prepare the way for his successors to do so. And thus the founder and the builder of the Jesuit order, the Jesuit Society, himself stamped upon it one of its leading and most distinguishing characteristics, the utter disregard of everything that does not contribute to its own ends and objects. And what is the first thing to go when the Jesuits come to town? Liberty. Religious liberty. Now think for a moment. The United States of America has become literally a powerhouse for the Jesuits. They've occupied this country since the colonial period. They've literally been unopposed. No action, no official action, either by the people or the government, has ever taken place against the Jesuits. How do you think these Jesuits, with this history behind them, how do you think the Jesuits are operating in Washington, D.C.? You've seen what kind of intrigues they relied upon in the past to extend their power and influence and control in Roman Catholic countries. Imagine an unrestrained area of operations in the United States of America, once believed to be a Protestant nation, enjoying the constitutional guarantee of religious liberty and taking advantage of that religious liberty, and to not only take over our government, but to use our government to bring the rest of the world to the heel of the Pope. Now you know why we are such a warring nation. We'll be back right after these messages.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
Record budget deficits, bankruptcies galore, and the U.S. dollar is at an all-time low. With today's gloomy economic outlook, safe investments are often hard to find. For over a decade, Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company has been helping people secure their future by investing in the precious metals. Melody has the honesty, integrity, and experience that is often lacking in the precious metals business. Let her put it to work for you. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. If you appreciate Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. If you'd like to contact me via email, please do so at tom@seawaves.us. That's tom@seawaves.us. Now, we're going to continuing our investigation into how the Jesuits forced their way into France against the popular opinion of the Jesuits at that time. We're going to see how the Jesuits were opposed successfully for a time in France. It says, but the enemies of the Jesuits in France, that's the people, the Gallican Church, and the Protestants especially. It says the enemies of the Jesuits in France were not so easily reduced to submission as the Cardinal of Lorraine, the Pope, and Ignatius Loyola had supposed. The powerful combination they had formed, with the assistance of the king and his courtiers, was not sufficient to remove or counteract the deep-seated antipathy existing in France against the Jesuits. The orders of the king were not mandatory without the approval of Parliament, which was the highest public representative body in France. When the letters patent of the king admitting the Jesuits came before Parliament, they were rejected with great unanimity, for the avowed reason that their introduction into France would be prejudicial to the public welfare and the Gallican Christians. The bulk of the French clergy and the entire faculty of the University of Paris also took strong and decided grounds against the Jesuits. The king, offended by this opposition to his royal will, and assuming an air of monarchical supremacy, commanded Parliament to register his letters patent. But Parliament again refused and appealed for advice to the Archbishop of Paris, the chief ecclesiastical functionary of the church. The Archbishop also decided against the Jesuits. Now, this is an Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Church voting against the admission of the Jesuits into France. They know what the Jesuits are all about. Now, even though they might sympathize to some degree with the Jesuits for wanting to do something about the Protestant Reformation, they know that the Jesuits are a sinister organization and that they will eventually rival the church itself and will eventually rival the papacy. And their fears have come to fruition in the world today, because now we have a Jesuit sitting in the papal chair. R.W. Thompson was correct, and the fears of the Archbishop of Paris was correct, and the fear of the French Parliament is correct. And it says the Faculty of Theology in the university unanimously charged the Jesuits, among other things, with arrogant presumption in assuming, quote, the unusual title of the name of Jesus, unquote, and with admitting into their society, quote, all sorts of persons, however criminal, lawless, and infamous they may be, unquote. You notice they had no respect at all for the individual members of the Jesuit order, including Ignatius Loyola. And he says they further declared the society to be, quote, dangerous as to matters of faith, capable of disturbing the peace of the church, overturning the monastic orders, and were more adapted to breaking down than to building up, unquote. And that's exactly what we read in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 15 and on. Is this the man who caused the world to tremble, who did shake kingdoms, who reduced the cities to rubble, who loosened not the bonds of his prisons? Words paraphrasing. Okay? This is how Satan works. And this is the business of the Jesuit order. And Parliament in France is justly suspicious of the Jesuit order. Now, this severe indictment is made more important and conspicuous by the fact that it was not preferred by Protestants. Okay? These aren't Protestants talking against the Jesuits. These are Roman Catholics. Gallicans and the Archbishop of Paris and Parliament. They're Catholics. France is a Catholic country. It says this severe indictment is made more important and conspicuous by the fact that it was not preferred by Protestants, but by Roman Catholics, who had for many centuries faithfully adhered to such teachings of the Church as had universally prevailed before the popes, in imitation of temporal monarchs, had built up the papal system. Okay? They held to the original Catholic faith that was widely held among Catholics before the papacy had built up its monarchical system of controlling the kings. Okay? That great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth, it didn't always reign over the kings of the earth. At least not in the Roman Catholic Church, at least not into the state that we see it today, or as it existed during the Dark Ages. Okay, it says, in addition to all this, the Archbishop of Paris issued an interdict against them. Okay, this is an official church action. This man speaks, the Archbishop of Paris speaks for the church, the Roman Catholic Church of France, and he issues an interdict. This is a legal restriction. A church restriction against the Jesuits, forbidding their exercise of any of the sacred functions. Okay, they can't serve the Mass, they can't hear confessions, they can't give absolutions, they can't participate in other words, he just reduced them to a secret society, which is exactly what they are. Now, the Bishop of Paris followed with other interdictions, and the entire clergy denounced the Jesuits in pulpits. Placards in censure of them were hawked about the streets. In other words, people protested the Jesuits publicly and held up signs as they marched up and down the streets protesting the Jesuit order. Now it says, at last the public indignation against them became so intense and violent that they were driven out of Paris and compelled to seek shelter elsewhere. Do you imagine we could ever muster that much Protestant resistance to the Jesuits in this country? To march up and down the streets with placards and signs denouncing the Jesuits and educating people about their diabolical history, about their meddling in public and civil affairs in order to subject us all to papal tyranny? Do you suppose there would be enough Protestant muster left in this once Protestant nation to do what the French Catholics had sense enough to do? Do you see how delinquent we are in comparison to the Catholics of France in their dealings with the Jesuit order? This should cause everyone who calls himself a Protestant to hang his head in shame. But it goes worse. It's far worse than just shame. We've allowed them to take over our government. A people that believes that they have the right to govern themselves have literally allowed the Jesuit order to take over their government without resistance. We didn't have the good sense, even of the deceived and deluded Catholics of France. Shame doesn't even describe it. It's apostasy, it's ignorance, it's apathy, it's cowardice not to resist the Jesuit order. Now, at last, the public indignation against the Jesuits became so intense and violent that they were driven out of Paris and compelled to seek shelter elsewhere. They did this, however, as they had done when forced by the popular tumult to leave Saragossa. That is, even the Spanish Catholics had forced the Jesuits out. It's getting worse and worse as we go. It says they did this, however, as they had done when forced by the popular tumult to leave Saragossa. That is, with the seeming appearance of submission, but with the real purpose of renewing their efforts when some occasion attended by mere favorable circumstances should arise, when the royal authority could be more successfully employed to defy the Gallican Church and the popular sentiment. So when it appears that the Jesuits have been defeated and they have left the country, that's when you really want to watch out. Okay? They always come back. They never go away. So that should indicate to my listeners, those who have the courage to admit it to themselves, that there's really only one solution. History has proven over and over and over there's really only one solution to get rid of the Jesuits. And I'll leave it to your common sense to dictate what that solution is. And it says this was at that time, has been ever since, and is today an essential part of Jesuit tactics, in the pursuit of which they are persistent and tireless. They are persistent and tireless. They never, never, never give up. And it says, when they have had the united aid of popes and monarchs, of church and state, they have generally succeeded among populations not awakened by Protestant influences to a just appreciation of their own rights and dignity. Did you get the inference here? It says, and where they have had the united aid of the popes and monarchs of church and state, they have generally succeeded among populations not awakened by Protestant influences to a just appreciation of their own rights and dignity. So what does that tell you about Protestantism today? Do any of us appreciate our rights and our dignity and assert those rights and dignities against an encroaching federal, state, and local government that is trying to Catholicize the country? Do our Protestant churches warn us of the peril that exists from Jesuit occupation of our country? Do our Protestant churches teach us that the Jesuit order's primary area of operations is governmental control, and that through the government, uniting the government with the Roman Catholic Church brings tyranny and oppression to the people, and that as Protestants it is our duty, our responsibility to maintain the liberties that Christ gave us? Do you see how fully and completely we have failed as Protestants in this country? And do you comprehend more fully what a horror the Counter-Reformation, Vatican Council II, and ecumenism is to the Protestant faith? It says, and where they have had the united aid of popes and monarchs, that is, of church and state, they have generally succeeded among populations not awakened by Protestant influences to a just appreciation of their own rights and dignity. It says, in the case we have been considering, they did not have very long to wait before the king, the cardinal of Lorraine, and their allies, patronized by the Pope, secured for them a conspicuous triumph over public opinion in France. The combination formed for that purpose needed their assistance in the bloody and congenial work of persecution, and this furnished a pretext for their introduction into France, notwithstanding the odium in which they were almost universally held. So to the Jesuits, it doesn't mean a whit what the people of this country think. If they can unite the church and the state, they will do whatever they please, even to the point of bringing the Inquisition to the United States of America and setting up government-sponsored religious persecution against any and all opposition to the Pope's New World Order. And that's what's happening. And without nary a cry from the so-called Protestant churches in this country. We've been stripped of the knowledge of the Jesuits. We've been stripped of the principal knowledge of Protestantism. And we've even gone so far as to consider the Roman Catholic Church just another denomination of Christianity. Who's in control of the education system in this country? And what responsibility falls upon the Protestant churches to educate, despite the lack of good, true important, infinitely important information omitted from the public school curriculum. The Protestant churches will never serve Christ until they become historically literate. Literate in their Protestant history and literate in Roman Catholic history and particularly literate in Jesuit history. And that's why I'm reading this book on Inquisition Update. I hope my listeners will more and more appreciate this book and R.W. Thompson and Inquisition Update for filling a vital void in education in this country, both the public school system and in the churches. He says the combination formed for that purpose needed the Jesuits' assistance in the bloody and congenial work of persecution, and this furnished a pretext for the Jesuits' introduction into France, notwithstanding the odium in which they were almost universally held. The historian Niccolini says, quote, "Soon they were called into France to help and cheer that atrocious and cruel hecatomb, that bloody debauch of priests and kings, the Saint Bartholomew," unquote. And that's a direct reference to the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre, which eventually, was a culmination of the influence of the Jesuits in France. A wholesale slaughter of up to 70,000 French Huguenot, French Protestants. I want my listeners, when time avails itself, to Google the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre and read. And do you know that that day is celebrated in the liturgical calendar of the Roman Catholic Church, together with another Holocaust by the Roman Catholic Church against the Turks, and that day is celebrated on September 11th of each year. September 11th of each year is celebrated in commemoration of the extirpation and annihilation of the heretics of France and the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and also a similar massacre against Turks. Heretics, regarded as heretics in the Roman Catholic Church. September 11th on the liturgical calendar of the Roman Catholic Church. They even painted a double mural celebrating the side by side the massacre of the Turks and the massacre of the French Huguenots in France. Side by side. And the photograph is even available. The photograph of that painting is even available on the Wikipedia page having to do with the St. Bartholomew Massacre, and even the mention that September 11th is the date commemorating both. I'm telling you, 9/11 wasn't just an inside job. It was a Jesuit job. 9/11 was a Jesuit job. And thanks to researchers like Eric John Phelps and many others, have proven that the principal players in our government at that time were either High Knights of Malta or high-level Freemasons or Council on Foreign Relations members. 9/11 was a Jesuit job. And what did 9/11 precipitate that the Jesuits desired more than anything else? A suspension of our Constitution and the replacement by what is called the Patriot Act. It literally wipes away all of our Protestant liberties. And it was even written, compiled, and ready for publish even before 9/11 by an adjunct professor of Jesuit Georgetown University, Viet Din, Assistant Attorney General to Ecumenical Evangeli Belly John Ashcroft. 9/11 was a Jesuit job. Call Alex Jones this afternoon and tell him that. Now, thus far, a clear and distinct view is furnished of the estimate at which the Jesuits were held during the lifetime of their founder by those who were steadfastly obedient to the Christian teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? These aren't Protestant protestations against the Jesuit order. R.W. Thompson is showing us the Roman Catholic opposition to the Jesuit order. And he says none of the opposition here noted came from Protestants, but alone from those who attached to the church, those attached to the Roman Catholic Church, which the Jesuits professed to be serving. It originated with those who had a most favorable opportunity of becoming familiar with the general character and purposes of Ignatius Loyola, many of whom, in all probability, had opportunities of seeing and conversing with him directly, as did Melchior Cano, the Dominican monk, had done. His boasts of extraordinary sanctity, of his frequent interviews with Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary, and his impious pretense that he occupied the place of God in the world, and like him, possessed miraculous powers, misled very few besides those who became his minions, or those who expected to profit by alliance with him. We shall see all this still more fully in the subsequent events which attended the final introduction of the Society of the Jesuits into France, all of which combined to show the methods by which, in the course of time, it became odious to the Christian populations of Europe, was expelled ignominiously from all the Christian nations, and was at last, when its iniquities could be patiently borne no longer, suppressed and abolished by a pope distinguished for his Christian virtue and purity of life. So says R.W. Thompson. But the Roman Catholic Church, the papacy itself, was constrained to suppress the Jesuit order because it dawned on the papacy that this order had the capability of overthrowing the papacy itself, such as we see today in the current Jesuit pope, the very first one in history, Francis I, a criminal from Argentina. We'll continue with our reading of the book Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson on the program tomorrow. We'll begin Chapter 6, entitled The Struggle for France. Not all of the Jesuits' victories are easy. The only one that was easy was the United States of America, sadly to say. We'll see you tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left-behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.